In the mid-1960s, the world watched the skies with a sense of awe and certainty. The space race was in full swing, and by every public metric, the Soviet Union was winning. They had launched the first satellite, Sputnik, shocking the world. They had sent the first man into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, making him a global icon. They had performed the first spacewalk, with Alexei Leonov floating in the void of space to the outside world, and even too many within the American government. The conclusion was inescapable. The Soviets were on an unstoppable trajectory to be the first to land a man on the moon. It seemed to be a matter of when, not if. But behind the Iron Curtain, hidden from the cheering crowds in Red Square and the prying eyes of Western intelligence, a very different story was unfolding. It was a story of a desperate secret race against time, a program plagued by bitter rivalries, impossible deadlines, and a catastrophic design flaw, all centered around a single enigmatic figure whose very identity was the most closely guarded secret in the entire Soviet Union. This man was known only by his title, the chief designer. In public, he was a ghost, a nameless, faceless entity, credited with the USSR's incredible string of space victories. In reality, he was Sergei Korolev, the undisputed father of the Soviet space program. His life story was a microcosm of the brutal contradictions of the Soviet state. As a brilliant young aeronautical engineer in the 1930s, Korolev was swept up in the insanity of Stalin's Great Purge. He was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason, beaten and tortured by the NKVD, and sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian gulag. He was sent to a gold mine in the frozen wastes of Kolyma, a death sentence for most. But as World War II raged, Stalin realized he needed his best minds, even the ones he had imprisoned. Korolev was recalled from the brink of death and put to work in a Sharashka, a special prison for scientists, tasked with designing rockets for the war effort. It was this experience surviving the very worst of the system he served that forged Korolev into a leader of immense talent, ambition, and ruthless determination. After the war, he became the driving force behind the Soviet missile program, and, later, its space exploration efforts. He was a visionary on par with America's Werner von Braun. But unlike von Braun, who was a public figure in the United States, Korolev's name was a state secret. The Kremlin feared that if his identity were known, he would become a target for assassination. So, he toiled in anonymity, a phantom orchestrating the conquest of space. When President John F. Kennedy threw down the gauntlet in 1961, famously declaring that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev publicly dismissed it as a capitalist stunt. But privately, he summoned Korolev and gave him the secret. Unofficial go-ahead. Beat the Americans to the moon, at any cost. The secret moon race had begun. Korolev immediately began to sketch out his vision. To get to the moon, he needed a rocket of unimaginable power, a heavy-lift vehicle on the scale of the Americans' planned Saturn V. But as he began to assemble the pieces for this monumental task, he ran into a wall, not of physics, but of personality. His path was blocked by his own brilliant and deeply resentful rival, Valentin Glushko. Was the Soviet Union's top engine designer, a genius in his own right, but a man who held a deep-seated grudge against Korolev, whom he blamed for his own imprisonment during the purges. When Korolev approached Glushko to design the massive, powerful engines needed for his moon rocket, Glushko agreed, but with one condition: he would only work with his preferred type of fuel, hypergolic propellants. These were highly toxic, corrosive chemicals that would ignite on contact with each other. While they were reliable and could be stored for long periods, they were far less powerful and efficient than the cryogenic fuel super liquid oxygen and kerosene that Werner von Braun was using for the Saturn V. Korolev, a staunch advocate for cryogenics, refused. He knew that to generate the immense thrust needed for a lunar mission, hypergolic fuels were a dead end. The feud escalated. Glushko, leveraging his political connections, flatly refused to design the cryogenic engines Korolev demanded. It was a catastrophic clash of egos between the two most important men in the Soviet space program, a conflict that would ultimately doom their lunar ambitions before they even began, with Glushko, the nation's premier engine designer, refusing to cooperate. Korolev was forced to turn to a less experienced engineer, Nikolai Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov was a brilliant designer of jet engines for aircraft, but he had never built a rocket engine of the scale and power that was needed. He could not produce a single, massive engine equivalent to the American F-1. Instead, he proposed a radical, and ultimately fatal, alternative. Cluster in. If they couldn't build one giant engine, they would simply use a massive number of smaller ones, all firing at once. T's decision, born out of a personal feud, became the original sin of the Soviet moon program. Korolev's Grand Rocket, which he named the N-1, was designed with a first stage powered by no fewer than 30 of Kuznetsov's small NK-15 engines, arranged in 2 concentric rings. It was a design of breathtaking complexity. An intricate web of pipes, valves, and wiring was required to feed and control all 30 engines simultaneously. If just one of these engines failed or fired out of sync, the delicate balance of thrust would be thrown off, potentially leading to a catastrophic failure. The Saturn V, by contrast, used only 5, far more powerful and reliable engines, making it an infinitely simpler and safer machine. The N-1 was a monster, a desperate gamble on brute force and complexity. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But as the 1960s progressed, Korolev, using his immense political will and organizational genius, pushed the project forward. Despite the design flaws and the internal opposition, it seemed he might just be able to pull it off. Then, in January of 1966, disaster struck. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, the man whose sheer force of will was holding the entire secret program together, died unexpectedly on the operating table during what should have been a routine surgery. The heart of the Soviet moon program had stopped beating. The secret race was now left in the hands of lesser men, while their deeply flawed, monstrous rocket was still on the drawing board. The Americans were pulling ahead, and the clock was ticking faster than ever. The sudden death of Sergei Korolev in January 1966 was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a decapitating blow to the entire Soviet space program. He had been the undisputed leader, the single point of authority whose iron will and political genius had forced a sprawling, dysfunctional bureaucracy to achieve the impossible. He was the visionary, the taskmaster, and the chief political operator, all rolled into one. With his heart no longer beating, the program he had built was left leaderless, adrift in a sea of competing interests and festering rivalries. A power vacuum was created, and into it stepped Korolev's deputy. Mishno was a brilliant and highly competent engineer who had been Korolev's right-hand man for years. He knew the N-1 rocket and the lunar program inside and out. But he was not Korolev. He lacked his predecessor's almost mythical status, his political clout within the Kremlin, and his ruthless ability to bend the Soviet system to his will. Mishien inherited a deeply flawed rocket, a program years behind schedule, and a web of powerful men-rival designers, government ministers, and military leaders who had only been kept in line by their fear of and respect for Korolev. Now, they were unleashed, each vying for resources and influence. The program, once driven by a singular vision, descended into a chaos of bureaucratic While the Soviets were in disarray, the American Apollo program was firing on all cylinders, achieving a series of stunning and highly public successes. Under the focused, centralized leadership of NASA and Werner von Braun, the Saturn V rocket, the American counterpart to the N-1, was ACing its test flights. The contrast between the two programs was stark. While the Soviets operated in total secrecy, every American launch was a global television event, a powerful display of technological prowess and national confidence. The ultimate psychological blow came in December of 1968. As Mitch and his team struggled to assemble their first N-1 rocket, the crew of Apollo, 8 Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders became the first humans to leave Earth's orbit, travel to the moon, and circle it 10 times before returning safely. Their Christmas Eve broadcasts from lunar orbit, where they read from the Book of Genesis, was a moment that captivated the world. For the engineers and cosmonauts in the secret Soviet program, it was a devastating defeat. The Americans had reached the moon first. The race to be the first to the moon was over. The only prize left was to be the first to land on it, and the Soviets knew they were now desperately, catastrophically behind. The pressure on mission was immense. The Kremlin demanded a response. The entire program's focus was now on a single, monumental task: getting the N-1 rocket off the ground. At the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a vast, secret spaceport, in the desolate steppes of Kazakhstan, an unprecedented engineering effort was underway. A gigantic new launch complex, Site 110, had been constructed, featuring 2 massive launch pads and an assembly building so large it was known as the Cathedral. The logistical challenges were a nightmare. The N-1 stages were too large to be transported by rail from their factories near Moscow. Instead, each piece had to be loaded onto enormous, custom-built barges and shipped on a winding 2-week journey down rivers and canals to the Cosmodrome. Once there, thousands of engineers and workers raced against time in the brutal Kazakh climate, where temperatures could swing from scorching summers to bone-chilling winters, to assemble the most complex rocket ever conceived. It was during this frantic assembly process that the N-1's original sin its reliance on 30 smaller engines became a terrifyingly practical problem. The first stage, known as Block A, was an engineer's nightmare. A tangled spaghetti of pipes, valves, and wiring had to be meticulously connected to feed and control all 30 engines. The risk of a fuel leak, a faulty valve, or an electrical short was magnified 30-fold, but the most dangerous decision of all had already been made back in Moscow. The N-1's first stage would never be test-fired on the ground as a complete unit. The reason was a toxic combination of arrogance, haste, and a lack of funds. Building a test stand strong enough to hold down the colossal power of 30 engines firing at once would have been another massive, expensive, and time-consuming engineering project in itself. Korolev and Latter Mission gambled that they could bypass this crucial safety step. They would be testing the most complex and powerful rocket stage ever, built for the very first time during its actual maiden flight. It was a roll of the dice on a planetary scale, a decision that would have been unthinkable at NASA. Watching this terrifying gamble unfold was a small, elite group of men, the cosmonauts, who were secretly training for the lunar mission. They were the best of the best, heroes of the Soviet Union, but they were largely powerless. Forced to watch as engineers played Russian roulette with the machine that was supposed to carry them to the moon. At the top of the list to be the first Soviet on the moon was Alexei Lenov, the charismatic and universally respected hero of the first spacewalk. Lenov was deeply involved in the program, and he was horrified by what he saw. He would later recount the infighting, the corner-cutting, and the sheer, unmanaged complexity of the N-1. He and his fellow cosmonauts knew the rocket was a death, but they were soldiers, and they were prepared to fly it if ordered. Their fate rested entirely on the success of the unmanned test flights. After years of turmoil, frantic construction, and countless delays, the moment finally arrived. In February of 1969, the first N-1 rocket, designated 3L, stood fully assembled on Launch Pad 110 East. It was a colossal white spear, stretching 345 feet into the sky, dwarfing everything around it. The Americans were just 5 months away from their planned Apollo 11 landing attempt. For Vasily Mishin and the thousands of engineers who had poured their lives into the project, this was their last, best hope to stay in the race, to leapfrog the Americans and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. As the final countdown echoed across the frozen Kazakh steppe, the hopes of a superpower rested on the simultaneous, perfect ignition of 30 rocket engines that had never once been tested together. It was the greatest gamble in the history of spaceflight, and it was about to go catastrophically wrong. As the final countdown for the first N-1 rocket echoed across the frozen Kazakh steppe on February 21, 1969, the hopes of a superpower rested on a monumental gamble. Inside the underground launch control bunker, Vasily Mishin and his team of engineers watched their monitors, their careers and their nation's pride hanging in the balance. They were about to ignite the most complex and powerful rocket stage ever built, a stage that had never once been fully tested on the ground. Everything depended on the simultaneous, perfect ignition and performance of 30 individual rocket engines. The final seconds ticked away. At 0 a deafening roar erupted across the desolate landscape. A colossal pillar of fire and smoke engulfed the launch pad as all 30 engines of Block A thundered to life. For a breathtaking moment, it was a vision of triumph. The gigantic rocket, weighing over 6 million pounds, majestically lifted off the pad, slowly at first, then gathering speed, climbing higher and higher into the clear winter sky. It was working. The world's most powerful rocket was flying. Inside the control bunker, a wave of relief and cautious celebration washed over the team. For 60 seconds, the flight was perfect, but then disaster struck. High in the rocket's tail section, a complex and tightly packed area of plumbing and wiring, a pressure fluctuation caused a fuel line to rupture. Highly volatile kerosene began to spray onto the hot engine components, and a fire erupted. The flames began to burn through the critical wiring of the rocket's control system, a primitive computer known as Cord. The Cord system had been programmed with a specific, and ultimately fatal, logic. To maintain stability if an engine failed, it was designed to automatically shut down the engine directly opposite it in the 30-engine cluster to keep the thrust balanced. As the fire chewed through the wiring, the Cord system began to receive a cascade of false signals, tricking it into believing that multiple engines were failing. Following its programming, it began to issue shutdown commands. At 68 seconds into the flight, the system, in a state of electronic panic, sent the command to shut down all 30 engines. All at once, the immense thrust vanished. The massive rocket, now several miles high and traveling at supersonic speed, suddenly went silent. It hung in the air for a moment before pitching over, plummeting back towards the earth, and disintegrating in a massive fireball that lit up the sky for miles. The first gamble had failed. The explosion was a devastating blow, but there was no time for despair. The clock was ticking. The Americans were preparing for their final dress rehearsals, Apollo 9 and Apollo 10, ahead of their planned landing attempt in July. Mission and his engineers knew that they had one last, desperate chance to leapfrog the Americans and snatch a historic victory. The investigation into the first failure revealed the Cord system's flawed logic, and engineers worked around the clock to implement fixes. A new N1 rocket, designated 5L, was painstakingly assembled and rolled out to the second, undamaged launch pad at Site 110. The pressure was unimaginable. This single launch, scheduled for July 3, 1969, was the Soviet Union's last hope to land a man on the moon first. If feat failed, the race was over. The entire program, the careers of thousands, and the pride of a nation rested on this one, final throw of the dice. The night of July 3rd was filled with an almost unbearable tension. Just 17 days before Apollo 11 was scheduled to depart for the moon, the second N1 stood bathed in floodlights, a monument to Soviet ambition. The countdown reached 0. Once again, the 30 engines ignited in a thunderous roar. The rocket began to climb. But this time the catastrophe came almost instantly. As the rocket cleared the launch tower, just seconds after liftoff, a single loose metal bolt, likely shaken loose by the intense vibrations, was sucked into the liquid oxygen turbopump of engine number 8. The pump, spinning at thousands of rotations per minute, instantly disintegrated in a violent explosion. The blast severed surrounding fuel and electrical lines, and a massive fire erupted in the rocket's base. The Cord system, sensing the engine failures, once again began shutting down the remaining engines. The rocket, barely a few hundred feet in the air, lost almost all of its upward thrust. It hung in the sky for a terrifying, silent moment, and then began to fall back, directly onto the launch pad from which it had just departed. What happened next was an apocalypse. The fully fueled rocket, carrying nearly 2,000 tons of highly explosive liquid oxygen and kerosene, slammed back down onto launch pad 110 East. The impact triggered a cataclysmic explosion, the largest in the history of rocketry, and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. The blast was estimated to be equivalent to about 7 kilotons of TNT, roughly half the power of the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The launch pad and its 475-foot-tall tower were instantly vaporized, leaving behind a blackened, molten crater. A terrifying mushroom cloud rose 2.5 miles into the sky. The shockwave shattered windows up to 25 miles away. Debris, some pieces the size of a small car, rained down over a radius of 6 miles. It was a disaster of unimaginable scale, a secret Chernobyl that the world would not learn about for another 20 years. Just 17 days later, a global television audience of over 500 million people watched, mesmerized, as Neil Armstrong stepped out of the Apollo 11 lunar module and onto the surface of the moon. While America celebrated its greatest triumph, the Soviet lunar program lay in smoldering ruins, buried under a mountain of lies and the scorched, radioactive earth of Bikaner. The race was lost, but the program, incredibly, stumbled on for a few more years. Driven by political inertia, 2 more N-1 rockets were launched. In June of 1971, the third N-1 experienced an uncontrolled roll immediately after clearing the tower and disintegrated. The fourth and final launch took place in November of 1972. It was the most successful flight yet, flying for almost 107 seconds before the first stage engines shut down prematurely, causing another massive explosion. It was the last flight of the N-1. The rocket, the centerpiece of the Soviet Union's lunar ambitions, had failed 4 times in 4 attempts, each one ending in a spectacular fireball. The dream of a red flag on the moon was dead. For the Soviet government, humiliated and defeated, the only mission left was to ensure that the rest of the world never found out that they had even been trying. The final, and in some ways most successful, phase of the Soviet lunar program was about to begin. The fourth and final explosion of an N-1 rocket in November of 1972 was not just the end of a flight, it was the death of a dream. Inside the secret halls of the Kremlin and the design bureaus of the Soviet space program, the truth was now undeniable. The race to the moon was lost. Their monstrous rocket, the centerpiece of their ambitions, was a catastrophic failure. Billions of rubles had been vaporized on the launch pads of Bikaner. After nearly a decade of frantic, secret work, they had nothing to show for it but scorched earth and a series of spectacular failures. For the Soviet government, a regime built on the projection of strength and infallibility, this national humiliation could never be admitted. The only mission left was to ensure that the rest of the world, and more importantly, their own people, never found out that they had even been in the race at all. The final, and in some ways most successful, phase of the Soviet lunar program was about to begin. The cover-up, the Great Deception, was a masterpiece of state-controlled propaganda. The Soviet government never, ever officially acknowledged that they had been in a race to land a man on the moon. They masterfully crafted and promoted a public narrative that their space program had always been on a different, more scientific and responsible path. They portrayed the American Apollo program as a reckless, dangerous, and wasteful stunt of capitalism, a political gamble that put astronauts' lives at risk for mere prestige. In contrast, they championed their own, very real, successes with robotic probes. They celebrated the incredible achievements of the Lunokhod rovers, the first remote-controlled vehicles to explore another world, and the Luna sample return missions, which brought back lunar soil automatically. They shifted their focus to the development of long-duration orbital space stations, Salyut and later Mir, framing them as the smarter and more sustainable approach to space exploration. To the average Soviet citizen, and to most of the outside world, this was the only story they knew. The narrative was so successful that for decades, Western historians genuinely debated whether the Soviets had ever been serious about a manned lunar landing. Behind the scenes, the erasure of the program was not just rhetorical, it was brutally physical. In 1974, the manned lunar program was officially cancelled. In a final, bitter twist of irony, the man appointed to take over the entire space program and preside over its dissolution was none other than Sergei Korolev's lifelong rival. Glashko, the man whose refusal to build the right engines had crippled the N-1 from the very beginning, now had the power to wipe his rival's legacy off the face of the earth. And he did so with a vengeance. He ordered that all remaining N-1 rocket hardware fully assembled stages, dozens of the world's most powerful rocket engines, and mountains of specialized equipment be physically destroyed. Workers were ordered to take blowtorches and sledgehammers to the colossal rocket stages, cutting them up for scrap metal. It was a vindictive, systematic destruction of billions of rubles of hardware and a decade of human effort. All photographs of the N-1 rocket were classified as top secret. All blueprints and technical documents were locked away in secret state archives. The very existence of the Soviet manned lunar program became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War, a secret known only to the few thousand insiders who were sworn to absolute silence. The giant, billion-ruble launch complex at Baikonur Site 110 was abandoned, left to rust and decay in the harsh Kazakh weather, a silent, colossal tombstone for a dream the world never knew existed. For years, the secret held, but eventually, cracks in the wall of silence began to appear. Western intelligence, of course, had never been completely in the dark. American spy satellites had photographed the massive N1 on the launch pad throughout the late 60s and early 70 segundos. They had also photographed the apocalyptic aftermath of the explosions. The United States government knew that the Soviets had a massive moon rocket, and they knew that it had failed catastrophically. But they chose to remain silent. In an era of delicate Cold War, diplomacy, or data, there was no strategic advantage in publicly humiliating a rival superpower over a race that America had already decisively won. So, the secret remained safe. The real breakthrough came not from spies, but from within the Soviet Union itself. In the late 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced his policy of glasnost, or openness. For the first time in generations, it was no longer a crime to speak about the state's failures. The floodgates opened. Journalists and historians, who had long suspected the truth, began to investigate. And more importantly, the veterans of the secret program were finally free to speak. Engineers who had poured their lives into the N1 began to write their memoirs. And former cosmonauts, like Alexei Leonov, the man who would have been the first Soviet on the moon, began to tell the incredible, heartbreaking story of their hidden history. The story finally broke in a major way in the West in 1989, when the first official photographs and design details of the N1 were published in American aerospace journals, stunning an entire generation of space enthusiasts and historians who had only known the official propaganda. The sheer scale and ambition of the secret program were breathtaking. The declassified documents and revealed memoirs tell a story not just of a failed rocket, but of a hidden history, a parallel space race that was fought and lost in complete secrecy. They show that the Soviet Union lost the race to the moon not because of a lack of genius, resources, or will. They had all three in abundance. They lost because of petty human failings that were magnified by a dysfunctional and paranoid political system. They lost because of the bitter rivalry between two brilliant men, a feud that forced a catastrophic design flaw upon their greatest creation. They lost because that system could not tolerate a single man, Sergei Korolev becoming too powerful, leaving a vacuum when he was gone. And they lost because they were in such a hurry that they gambled on a design they had never fully tested. The story of the N1 is one of the great what-ifs of the 20th century. What if Korolev had not died? Could his authority have forced a better design? What if they had taken the time to build a proper test stand? What if one of those rockets had flown true? How different would history be if a red flag had been planted on the moon in the spring of 1969? We will never know. But the secret files prove that the race to the moon was far closer and far more dramatic than the world ever imagined.